Chapter 1. You going to raise or fold, mister? Because I got a wife at home, and she's already suspicious of my whereabouts. Eldridge Sample looked at his cards. Looked at the man who'd said it, a feed merchant named Burl Oates who wore his tells on his face like a bill posted to a fence post, and who had just touched the left side of his collar for the third time in 20 minutes, which meant the hand he was holding was either very good or he wanted Sample to think it was. And Sample had watched him touch that collar twice already when he had nothing, and once when he had a full house, so the math on Burl Oates was an ongoing project rather than a settled question. "Call," Sample said, and put his coins in. Oates had 2 pair, jacks over 6s. Sample turned over 3 10s, and pulled the pot toward him with one hand while he picked up his whiskey glass with the other, and the glass was nearly empty, and the whiskey was poor, and he was tired of the taste of it, but the alternative was being the man sitting at a card table in the Meridian Saloon in Hays City, Kansas, drinking nothing, which struck him as worse. That was the trouble with Hays City. Everything here was a choice between bad and slightly worse. He'd been 11 days in this place. He knew the number precisely the way a prisoner knows it, scratched somewhere in the back of his thinking where he kept accounts. He'd arrived on a Thursday with $41, a good horse, a Spencer carbine that he'd taken off a man in Wichita who no longer needed it, and the reasonable expectation that the bounty board at the sheriff's office would have something worth his attention within a week. The board had let him down. 3 names on it when he arrived, the same 3 names today. Petty men, small crimes, the kind of warrant where the reward didn't cover the boot leather required to track them, let alone the risk of whatever resistance they might offer. Sample had stood before that board this morning, the way he stood before it every morning, and read the names again, and felt the same dull weight settle across his shoulders. He was not built for stillness. This was a thing he understood about himself without pleasure or pride, the same way he understood that he couldn't abide in closed spaces for long, or that his right knee predicted rain better than any almanac published east of the Mississippi. His body had been organized around movement and purpose for so long that idleness didn't just bore him, it made him mean. He could feel it happening at the edges, a slow sourness creeping into his responses, a shortness with people who deserved better. Tommy behind the bar had said something cheerful to him yesterday morning, and Sample had answered in a way that made the boy flinch, and he'd caught himself and apologized, which was not something he did easily, and the whole episode had annoyed him further. The saloon smelled like sawdust and spilled beer and the particular unwashed warmth of men spending a weekday afternoon indoors, which was what the Meridian smelled like every day. And Sample had stopped noticing it around day 4, which was itself a thing that bothered him. You stopped noticing a smell because you'd become part of it. Outside, through the warped glass of the front window, Hays City arranged itself in the mid-afternoon light, a main street of raw lumber storefronts, their facades tall to make them look more permanent than they were, paint already weathering off the newer ones, as if the wood itself was skeptical of the whole enterprise. The barber shop, the assay office, which did very little business, the land office, which did more, a Methodist church that had been framed up in the spring and still lacked 3 walls, the congregation apparently trusting that God would motivate someone to finish it before winter. The whole street had the feel of a place holding its breath, waiting to see whether the railroad spur that was supposed to arrive next year actually would, or whether Hays City would join the long inventory of Kansas towns that had died between the promise and the delivery. Sample had been in enough of those towns to recognize the waiting in the air of this one. The card game broke up around 3 o'clock. Oates collected his remaining money with the careful dignity of a man who had lost more than he'd planned, and intended to reconstruct in his own memory a version of events in which this was not quite so. The other 2 players, a young drover whose name Sample had not retained, and an older man who worked at the land office and played cards with a bureaucrat's conservatism, never risking, never winning much, pushed back their chairs and went about whatever business they had. Sample remained. He spread the cards out in a slow fan across the table and looked at them without seeing them. The afternoon light came through the window and lay in yellow bars across the floor. A fly navigated the rim of his glass. The barkeep, Tommy, wiped the same section of bar he'd been wiping for the better part of an hour, and Sample understood this to be a form of meditation rather than hygiene. The deputy came in at 3:30. His name was Chet Flowers, and he was 24 years old, and he wore his badge with the conscious awareness of a man who had not yet forgotten that he was wearing it. He was not a bad deputy. He was not corrupt, not lazy, not cruel. He was simply young and ambitious in the way of young men in small positions who can see larger positions from where they stand. He had come to talk to Sample every third day or so, always with the same conversation, dressed in slightly different clothes. Mr. Sample. Deputy. Flowers settled into the chair across from him without being invited. Sample noted this and said nothing about it. "You've been in town going on 2 weeks now," Flowers said. 11 days. Right. Flowers put his hands on the table, flat, and then seemed to reconsider and pulled them back and folded them in his lap. "Sheriff Beaumont was asking about your plans." "Sheriff Beaumont can ask me himself. He's got a bad knee. Doesn't walk over here much in the afternoons. I've got a bad knee, too. I walk over there every morning." Flowers looked at him steadily. He had good eyes, Sample would give him that. Light gray, serious, not given to sliding away when the conversation got direct. There was a reasonable lawman somewhere inside him that might emerge if the circumstances shaped him right and the wrong decision didn't harden him first. "You're not in any trouble," Flowers said. "The sheriff just likes to know who's in town and what their intentions are." "My intentions are to leave when there's a reason to leave. And there's no reason yet. Not one that's been posted." Flowers was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wagon rolled past on the street, its wheels cutting through the dried ruts with a sound like tearing cloth. A dog that lived under the saloon porch barked once and then thought better of it. "You ever think about settling?" Flowers said. Sample looked at him. "I mean," Flowers adjusted his hat, which didn't need adjusting. "A man with your background. You could deputy somewhere, if you wanted. Maybe eventually, sheriff. There are towns that'd be glad to have a man with a federal marshal's record." "I was a marshal for 14 years, Sample said. "I know what it pays. It's steady. So is pneumonia." Flowers almost smiled. He pushed back from the table and stood, and he was doing the thing young lawmen do when they've decided to let a conversation end, putting his hands on his belt, looking toward the door, manufacturing a reason to be somewhere else. "Well," he said, "I'm not going to cause trouble in your town, deputy. I don't cause trouble. I find it when it needs finding, and I resolve it." Flowers nodded. "That's what concerns the sheriff, I think. A man looking for trouble has a way of locating it. Only if it's there to find." After Flowers left, Sample sat a while longer. He gathered the cards and shuffled them slowly, the mechanical repetition of it settling something in his hands, if not in the rest of him, and he thought about the bounty board with its 3 tired names, and he thought about the trail west out of town that he'd ridden 2 miles along yesterday just to be moving, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was the problem. A man who had nothing particular to think about was a man with too much room in his head, and in Sample's experience, too much room got filled with the wrong things. He was on his second shuffle when the door opened and August Pell walked in. He knew immediately that this was a man in a specific kind of trouble, not because of any one thing, but because of the sum of all of them. The way Pell stood in the doorway half a second too long, scanning the room before committing to entering it. The way his eyes landed on Sample, and then cut away, and then came back. The twice looking of a man who'd been told what he was looking for, and was now verifying the description. The coat that was good wool, but badly cared for, like a man who once had the money for quality, and was now spending down his reserves. The hat held in both hands in front of him, turned slowly by nervous fingers. He was perhaps 50, narrow through the chest, with a face that had been anxious so long it had organized itself around anxiety, every line running in the direction of worry. He crossed the room in a path that avoided the other two afternoon drinkers at the bar, and he came to Sample's table and stood at the corner of it and said, "I'm looking for Eldridge Sample." "You found him. Somebody said that you do work for hire." Somebody was accurate. "The sheriff's office said you were here." "The deputy." Pell glanced toward the door, as though checking it was still there. "I hope that's all right, coming to find you like this. I didn't know the etiquette." "Sit down, Mr. Pell." August Pell. He sat and put his hat on the table, and his hands went flat on the wood the way Oates's had when he was overplaying a poor hand. Except on Pell there was no deception in it. It was just a man trying to keep himself still. "I need a guide. And protection, I suppose, though I don't like needing protection. I have never in my life required—" He stopped himself. "Sorry. I talk when I'm nervous." "I can see that. What kind of guide?" "Wagon train. 4 wagons. We're headed to Oregon Territory." Sample set the cards down. 4 wagons is a small party. "I know it. It started larger. We had 7 wagons back in Indiana, and then 2 families stopped in Missouri. One of them had a sick child, and the other one, I think, just lost their nerve, which I understand completely. I lost mine several times, but I kept going because there's nothing to go back to, so." He took a breath. "We're in Hays City now. We've been here 4 days waiting on a wheel repair and on finding you. Someone in Missouri mentioned your name." "Who?" "A cattleman. He'd seen you work somewhere. He didn't say where. He said, if I needed a guide who could handle himself and handle trouble, find Eldridge Sample. He said you were either in Kansas or you were in hell, and probably either way you'd be unhappy about it." Sample picked up his nearly empty glass and looked through it at the window. The afternoon was cooling, the light going amber, the street outside beginning to stir with the early evening traffic of men finishing work and considering what to do with the hours before dark. A thing he had learned about small towns was that they were most themselves at this hour, neither day nor full night, everyone in transition. "What's the route?" Sample said. Pell brightened at this. The question was practical, meant to be answered, and practical questions were Pell's native territory. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and spread it on the table, a hand-drawn map of indifferent cartography but reasonable intent. "We take the Smoky Hill Trail west to Denver, then north to Fort Laramie, and from there." "I know the route." "Yes. Of course." Pell smoothed the paper with his palm. "The thing is, we can't wait much longer. It's September now. If we don't leave within the next week, maybe 10 days, the passes get unreliable. I've read everything I can find on the subject and spoken to everyone who'd speak to me, and the consensus is that the window is closing. The window closed for most sensible parties in April." "Well," Pell met his eyes for the first time with something that was not apology in it. "We had delays." "What kind of delays?" A fractional pause. Something moved across Pell's face and settled back below the surface. Personal matters. Back east. They've been resolved. Sample looked at him for a long moment. Pell held the look with the effort of a man doing it deliberately, which told Sample more than if he'd done it naturally. "Who are the other parties?" Sample said. "A family named Creedmoor. Harlan and Ruth. They have a teenage boy, a good boy. Farmers originally, from Ohio, though they spent the last few years in Indiana." He folded the map carefully. "A widow named Elena Vasquez. 2 daughters, 8 and 10. Her husband died in the spring. Sickness, not violence, and she has family in Oregon Territory, cousins on her mother's side who've written encouraging things about the land there." He folded the map a second time. "And a man named Calhoun Doss, who is traveling independently but has pooled resources with the group. What do you know about Doss?" "He's capable, and he's quiet, and he pays his way." "That's not what I asked." Pell set the map on the table. His hands went flat again, and then he picked up his hat and turned it in his fingers and set it back down. "He's a man who needed to move west," Pell said. "Same as the rest of us." "And the delays back east?" "I told you. Personal matters." Sample let the silence sit between them. Outside, someone was hammering something, the sound coming through the saloon's board walls with the regularity of a slow clock. The barkeep, Tommy, had drifted to the far end of the bar and was engaged in quiet conversation with a man Sample recognized as a freight hauler who passed through town every 2 weeks and always drank rye and always tipped well, which Tommy remembered. "What are you paying?" Sample said. Pell named a figure. Sample put both hands on the table, which was the first time he'd done it, and looked at them. The figure Pell had named was real money, not a fortune, but genuine, more than the 3 names on the bounty board added together, more than another 3 weeks of cards in the Meridian would produce even if his luck ran exceptional. It was the kind of money that had thought behind it, a number calculated to be hard to refuse, which meant Pell had planned this conversation, which meant Pell was not simply the nervous, disorganized man he appeared to be, or was not only that. "Half on agreement," Pell said. "Half on arrival. 3/4 on agreement." Pell blinked. "That's... I'm the one doing the work between here and there. You want someone who'll fight for arrival, pay them like it. You want someone to stay bought the whole distance, pay them like that instead." Pell considered this. His jaw worked slightly, not chewing anything, just moving, a man thinking with his whole face. 3/4, he said. "Yes. All right." Sample stood up. He was 6 feet, and some change in boots, and when he stood in a room, it changed the geometry of the room in a way he'd never quite gotten used to and never mentioned. He picked up his glass, finished the last swallow of poor whiskey, set it down with a sound like a decision being made. "I'll want to meet them tonight," he said. "All of them. Creedmoor, the widow, and Doss." "Of course. We're camped on the east edge of town, past the... I know where the camping ground is. I've been here 11 days. He took his hat from the chair beside him and set it on. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock. Pell stood, and some of the tension came out of his shoulders, not all of it, but enough that his coat sat differently. He picked up his hat. "Mr. Sample, I want you to know that these are good people. Good families. They've had a difficult season, and they deserve..." "Mr. Pell." "Yes." 7 o'clock. Pell left with his hat turning in his hands, and Sample watched him go, watched the door close behind him, watched through the window as Pell stepped off the porch and moved up the street with the quick forward-leaning walk of a man whose primary mode was hurry. He sat back down and picked up the cards. The delays back east were personal matters. He shuffled. Calhoun Doss was a man who needed to move west. He cut the deck. The window for crossing was closing. He squared the cards and held them and looked at the door. He told Flowers he was not going to cause trouble, that he only found it when it needed finding. This was true. The trouble was that his finding threshold had dropped considerably over 11 days of this saloon and these cards and this indifferent whiskey. And the man who just walked out the door had trouble in his coat pocket, along with that map. Sample could feel it the way he felt, whether in his knee. Not in any one thing, but in the whole accumulation of a man trying to be more transparent than he was. Good families, Pell had said. Good families didn't sell their farms in Ohio and push west in September. Good families left in April with the other good families, in trains of 20 wagons or more, with safety in numbers against the things that lurked in the long spaces between civilization and its next outpost. Good families didn't have delays back east that resolved themselves and required no further elaboration. Sample was a man who'd spent 14 years as a federal marshal, and 4 years since as a man who operated in the difficult spaces between what the law covered and what it didn't. And in all that time he had developed exactly one reliable instinct, which was this: good people and bad circumstances were not mutually exclusive, and in fact found each other with a regularity that suggested some natural law he'd never seen written down. He could say no. He still could. The money was good, but he had some, and the bounty board might change in a week. Some significant criminal might pass through or operate nearby and give the board new names, and he could wait for that and do the clean work of finding a man with an official warrant behind him and delivering that man to the people with the warrant. Clean work. Work without ambiguity. He thought about 4 wagons moving west through September country, the grass going gold, and the sky going that particular high-altitude blue that appeared only in the weeks before the cold came to stay, the Rockies rising out of the distance like something a man might have invented if he hadn't seen them and needed to explain to someone what the word enormous was trying to say. He thought about the camping ground on the east edge of town where 4 wagons were parked, and a squirrely man named Pell was going to report back that Sample had said yes. He thought about the delays back east and the personal nature of them. He put the cards in his breast pocket and stood up and went to the bar and signaled Tommy for another whiskey, not because he wanted it, but because it was an hour until dinner, and he told Pell 7, which meant he had time to eat something and clear the whiskey out before he went to meet a man named Doss, who watched horizons with the attention of someone expecting to be found. "You look better," Tommy said, setting the glass down. "Then what?" "Then you have." "You've been?" Tommy searched for the word with the care of a young man who'd been wrong before. "Coiled," he said. Sample picked up the glass. "I'll be gone in a few days." Tommy nodded. He didn't ask where. That was one of the things Sample appreciated about the boy. He understood the limited scope of a barkeep's authority over a stranger's destination. "There a decent place to eat on this street?" Sample said. "Somewhere that isn't this." "Hetty's, down past the land office. Beef stew tonight." "Her stew is," Tommy paused. "It's honest," he said. "Honest is fine." He left 2 coins on the bar and took his hat and his whiskey and drank it standing at the end of the bar, looking out the window at the street, at the provisional storefronts and the church with its missing walls open to a sky that was moving toward the color of a bruise. And he watched a woman he didn't know cross the street below with a basket over one arm, walking with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had 3 more things to do before dark. And a man on a gray horse rode past going west, just passing through, and the dog under the porch barked at the horse and thought better of it again. 11 days. He finished the whiskey and set the glass down and went to find the honest stew, and behind him the meridian settled back into its afternoon sounds, cards, low voices, the fly navigating the rim of the empty glass he'd left, and the bounty board at the sheriff's office had the same 3 names it had always had, and the Kansas evening came on cool, and smelling of dust and dry grass, and the distant suggestion of something changing. The camps on the eastern edge of Hays City occupied a flat piece of ground where the town simply stopped trying. No last building, no fence, just the edge of the last lot, and then the prairie beginning its long, uninterrupted argument with the horizon. 3 other outfits were camped there when Sample arrived at 5 minutes past 7, the light nearly gone now, the sky a dark residue above the western mountains that were too far to see but whose presence you could feel in the way the air moved. Pell's 4 wagons were arranged in a loose grouping near the creek, each with a fire nearby, and Sample sat his horse at the edge of the camp and looked at the arrangement for 30 seconds before riding in. Not reading it, or not consciously, just letting the whole picture arrive before any single piece of it demanded attention. The Creedmoor fire was the centermost, the largest, and Ruth Creedmoor was moving around it with an authority that made clear this was her fire, and these were her organizational principles at work. Harlan Creedmoor sat on an overturned crate nearby, working at something on his boot with a small tool, not looking up, but not absent either. The boy, Tommy, no, that was the barkeep's name. This was the Creedmoor boy, whose name Sample didn't have yet, stood at the edge of the firelight watching Sample come in with an openness that was going to be either an asset or a liability, depending on what he was made of underneath it. Elena Vasquez fire was smaller, set back from the Creedmoor fire at a respectful distance. She sat with 1 daughter on either side of her, all 3 involved in some handwork that the firelight was probably insufficient for, but which she was doing anyway. She looked up when Sample's horse came in, and assessed him in a single, complete look before returning to her work, which told him she'd been watching for him and had gotten what she needed. Pell materialized from somewhere near the wagons, appearing with the anxious energy of a man who had been watching for Sample from the moment he'd left the saloon. "Mr. Sample." "Good, good." "Yes." He gestured toward the Creedmoor fire. "I thought we'd, if everyone gathered." "Calhoun Doss," Sample said. Pell looked toward the 4th wagon, the one set slightly apart from the others, where a fire burned low and deliberately, and a man sat beside it on a log, eating from a tin plate with the unhurried focus of someone who had decided to finish his meal first. He hadn't looked up when Sample rode in. Or he'd looked up and already looked away, which was different. "He knows you're here," Pell said too quickly. Sample dismounted and tied his horse to the near wagon wheel, and walked past Pell toward Doss's fire. He heard Pell fall into step behind him at a small distance, the way a man follows when he wants to be present but doesn't want to be in front. Doss looked up when Sample reached the edge of his firelight. He was younger than Sample had estimated from Pell's description, 30, maybe 32, with a lean, careful face that had been weathered beyond its years, and dark eyes that did exactly what Sample expected, which was to measure him without transaction, without the performance of friendliness or the performance of indifference. Just the measurement itself. He had hands that had done hard work, the knuckles prominent, the palms wide, and one of them held a fork loosely, and the other rested on his knee and didn't move toward the gun on his right hip, which was the relevant fact. "You're Sample," Doss said. "You're Doss." Doss took a bite of whatever was on the plate. Chewed. Swallowed. "August says you're the man." "August hopes I am." Something shifted in Doss's face that might have been the beginning of a smile, and then reconsidered. He set the fork on the plate, and the plate on the log beside him, and stood, and he was an inch shorter than Sample, the same lean build, the same quality of stillness that is not the absence of motion but its management. He put out his hand, and Sample shook it. "You've got questions," Doss said. "I've got all night." Pell behind him made a small sound. "Go get the Creedmoors," Sample said without turning. "Bring everybody to this fire. We'll do it once." He heard Pell move off with relief, the footsteps quick and willing. Doss picked up his plate and resumed eating, and Sample crouched at the edge of the fire and held his hands out to it, not because he was cold, but because it was something to do while he gathered the measure of this man and this camp, and this arrangement of wagons on the edge of a provisional town at the end of a September he was running out of ways to spend. The prairie came in close around the light. The stars overhead were extraordinary, in the way they always were out here. Too many and too bright, the sky showing its full inventory without the compromise of any city's glow. The creek ran nearby, a low sound under the fire's voice. Somewhere in the dark to the east, on a road that came from Ohio, whatever Pell called the delays back east, was resolving itself in the way that all unresolved things eventually did, by moving in the direction of the people trying to get away from it. Sample didn't know that part yet. He knew the fire. He knew the stars. He knew that tomorrow, or the day after, he was going to say yes to 4 wagons and a squirrely man's money and whatever came with it, because 11 days was long enough, and the calendar was closing, and west was the only direction that currently made any sense. He knew Doss was watching him from across the fire the way Sample watched people, reading terrain. He let him read. The Creedmoors were coming across the camp now, Ruth first, Harlan 2 steps behind with his boot repaired, the boy walking with the slightly self-conscious straightness of a 16-year-old in the presence of a man he's decided to admire before he's met him, which Sample found both understandable and premature. Elena Vasquez came from her fire with her daughters behind her, the younger one half asleep and leaning into her mother's side, the older one bright-eyed and taking in Sample with a frank curiosity that reminded him of no one so much as her mother. Pell came last, tying off the group, hands moving. 7 people, and a low fire, and the prairie waiting in all directions. Sample stood up from his crouch. "All right," he said. Chapter 2. Ruth Creedmoor said, "You drink coffee, Mr. Sample, or are you one of those men who thinks refusing hospitality is a form of strength?" Sample took the cup. She'd produced it before he answered, the pot already in her hand, which meant the question had been a test with a correct answer, and she'd decided in advance what she'd think of a man who got it wrong. She poured, and moved back to the fire, and Sample registered that she'd done it all without looking at him directly, the way experienced people managed assessment, sideways, peripheral, as if they weren't paying attention and were paying complete attention. Harlan Creedmoor stood on the other side of the fire with his arms crossed, not hostile, not welcoming, simply present in the way of a man who had decided to form his opinion after the available evidence was in rather than before. He was broad across the chest, deep-weathered, with hands that had spent years in conversation with difficult soil. His son stood beside him and slightly behind, mimicking the crossed arms with less conviction. Pell hovered at the edge of the firelight like a moth that had decided to be cautious about the flame for once. Elena Vasquez had settled on a camp stool with her younger daughter asleep against her side, the child's weight redistributing itself every few minutes in the boneless way of sleeping children. The older girl sat cross-legged at her mother's feet and watched Sample with eyes that had her mother's quality of measurement without yet having learned to make it less visible. Doss had followed Sample to the Creedmoor fire and taken a position at the outer edge of the group, slightly back from the others, not apart from them but not of them either, the geometry of a man who has joined something and is still negotiating the terms. Sample drank the coffee. It was good coffee, better than anything the Meridian had offered in 11 days. And this fact recalibrated something in his estimate of this group. A woman who made good coffee on a camp stove at the end of a hard-traveled day was a woman who had not abandoned her standards to circumstance, and that was information. "August tells me you know this route," Ruth said. She was back at the fire now, adjusting something in a pot that didn't need adjusting. "I've made it twice. Both ways. West the first time. East to bring somebody back." "How long does it take?" "Depends on weather, river levels, how many times your wagons break down, whether the people involved know how to be told something once." He looked at the boy when he said the last part, not to single him out, but because the boy needed to know the look was coming eventually, and it was better to get it over with. The boy held it without flinching, which Sample noted. "Best case, 6 weeks to Fort Laramie. 3 more to get through the passes if they cooperate." "And if they don't?" Harlan said. "We winter somewhere and try again in spring." Harlan looked at his wife. Ruth looked at the pot. The look between them covered a distance that only 2 people who'd been through something together could cross in a glance. "That's not acceptable," Ruth said. "Lots of things aren't acceptable. They happen anyway." Sample took another drink of the coffee. "The window is tight, but it's open. We leave in 3 days. Push hard through the first week, we'll have margin enough." 3 days, Pell said. "I was thinking, perhaps sooner. The Creedmoor wagon's wheel isn't finished. The wheelwright here does good work, and I won't have a wheel fail at a bad crossing because we were in a hurry. 3 days. Pell pressed his lips together and nodded twice, the quick assent of a man converting his anxiety into cooperation because the alternative was being told something he didn't want to hear about the consequences of haste. "Mr. Doss," Sample said. Doss looked at him across the fire. "You've traveled this far with these people." "I have." "How do you find them?" It was a question that could be taken several ways, and Doss understood all of them. He looked at the Creedmoors, at Vasquez and her daughters, at Pell, and Sample watched him do it, and watched the group receive the looking. Ruth with her chin lifted slightly, Harlan with no change at all, Pell with the fractional wince of a man waiting to be graded. "They cover ground," Doss said. "They don't complain past what's useful. The boy can handle horses." He paused. "Mrs. Vasquez's younger daughter cried for 2 nights outside of Indianapolis and hasn't made a sound since, which I take as a good sign." The older Vasquez girl looked up at Doss when he said this, a quick look, assessing whether this was kindness or observation, and Vasquez herself gave him nothing, which was its own kind of response. "You have military experience?" Sample said to Doss. "Some." "Where?" "Virginia, mostly. 62 and 63. "Which side?" "The one that lost." Harlan Creedmoor's jaw shifted. Ruth put the pot down, and Sample tracked these 2 reactions without looking at either of them directly, and he thought about Ohio, and about a man with a sister, and about what the war had done to the generation of men who'd come back from it or not come back the same way they'd left, and he let that information settle into the larger picture he was building of Calhoun Doss without drawing any conclusions about it yet. "That bother you?" Doss said. "Not in the way you mean," Sample said. Doss held his eyes and then looked back at the fire. Sample turned to Harlan. "You handled the team today?" "Since Missouri." "What's the lead pair?" "Belgians. Mare and gelding. She leads, he follows her lead. Smart animals. Oxen would be better for the terrain ahead." "I know it. Belgians are what I have." "All right." Sample looked around the group, the sleeping child, the watching child, Pell with his hands finally still, Doss at the edge of the light. "I want to see the wagons before I sleep. Inventory loads where things are packed. A wagon loaded wrong is a wagon that tips at the wrong moment. Tonight. Pell said. Is there a reason tomorrow is better? Pell opened his mouth and closed it. We'll start with yours, Sample said. Pell's wagon was what Sample expected from a man who had prepared for a journey the way men who read books about journeys prepare, thoroughly on paper, imperfectly in execution. The provisions were good, correctly calculated, the right balance of staples and preserved goods for a party of the given size. But they'd been loaded for convenience of packing rather than logic of need, the items most likely to be required daily, buried beneath items that would sit untouched for weeks. Sample stood in the wagon bed with a lantern, and Pell stood below on the ground, and Sample handed things down and told Pell where they'd be going when they were reloaded. And Pell wrote it in a small notebook with a pencil he kept behind his ear. You packed this yourself? Sample said. I did. With help? A pause. No. Sample looked at a crate of hand tools, good tools, well maintained, a carpenter's kit packed by someone who knew carpentry. He looked at the hands that had taken the crate from him, the wide, careful hands of August Pell in the lamplight. You're a builder. Was. Furniture, mostly. Some house framing. What happened to the business? Various things. Sample set a second crate on the edge of the tailgate, and Pell took it and set it on the ground beside the first. The night had gone fully dark now, the stars overhead doing their considerable work. And somewhere across the camp, Elena Vasquez was getting her daughters settled and speaking to them in Spanish too low to carry, just the cadence of it, a sound like water. The delay's back east, Sample said. Pell was quiet for long enough that Sample stopped what he was doing and looked down at him. Pell had the notebook open in one hand and the pencil in the other, and he was not writing in it. There was a situation, Pell said. With Doss. Pell looked up sharply. I'm not asking you to confirm it, Sample said. I'm telling you I know there's a situation with Doss, and that I'll hear what it is before those wheels start turning. That's, Pell recalculated something behind his eyes. That's fair. Yes. It is, that's fair. He put the pencil behind his ear. But it isn't my story to tell. Then I'll hear it from Doss. He won't want to. That's a separate question from whether he will. He handed the last of the reconfigured items down and stepped out of the wagon bed, and they reloaded it in the order Sample specified. And when it was done, Pell closed the tailgate and stood back and looked at the wagon as though it were a problem that had taken a shape he hadn't anticipated. He's a good man, Pell said. You've said that. I know I have. I'm saying it again because it's the thing I'm most sure of, and there are not a great many things I'm sure of right now. Sample looked at him. The lamplight caught the creases of Pell's face, the lines that worry had cut there over what had clearly been a bad year. And Sample thought about the furniture business and the good tools packed in a wagon going west, and whatever the delays had cost this man in money and in something harder to name. Who told you about me? Sample said. A cattleman in Missouri. Birch something. Or something Birch. He was at a Birch Calloway. That was it. You know him. I brought in a man he was owed money by. He was grateful. He spoke very highly of you. Calloway speaks highly of anyone who's useful to him. It's a professional tick. Sample picked up the lantern. Come on. The Creedmoor wagon was a different problem. Ruth had packed it the way a woman packs who has moved before and expects to move again. Not neat, but intelligent. Every item in a location that bore a relationship to every other item. The logic of it slightly obscure until Sample traced it and then entirely clear. He moved 3 things, explained why, and Ruth said I had those there for a reason, and he explained the reason he was moving them, and she said, "That's a better reason," and that was the end of it. Harlan watched this exchange from outside the wagon with his arms recrossed and said nothing. The boy, his name was James, Sample had learned, which Pell had offered and the boy had not corrected, crouched beside the rear wheel and ran his fingers along the new section of rim in the way of a young man who has watched something be made and is trying to understand how. "Is it solid?" Sample said to him. James looked up. "Yes, sir. Endicott does good work." "You watched him do it." "Most of it." "What did you learn?" James thought about it, with the care of someone who understood the question was real. "That you have to heat the metal even, or it'll warp when you cool it. And that it's as much about the cooling as the heating." "That applies to more things than iron," Sample said, and moved to the Vasquez wagon. Elena Vasquez was standing at her tailgate when he arrived. Her daughters were in their bedrolls in the wagon, and she'd come out and closed the rear canvas behind her so the lamplight wouldn't disturb them. She had a shawl over her shoulders against the cooling night, and she stood with a stillness that wasn't resignation or patience. It was simply someone who had reached the end of a long day and was conserving what was left. "I would like to check your load," Sample said. "I know what you want." She unlatched the tailgate. "I'll tell you what's in it so you don't have to wake my daughters moving things," she told him. He listened, asking questions, and she answered them with precision, weights, quantities, positions, and he made 2 adjustments, both of which she accepted without comment. And when he was done, she relatched the gate with the economical movements of someone who had done it many hundreds of times. "You're not from Indiana," Sample said. "No." "Texas, maybe." "East Texas." Something shifted in her face that was not quite a smile. "Nacogdoches. I left when I was 17. Long way from Oregon Territory. Everything is a long way from Nacogdoches." She drew the shawl tighter. "My husband wanted to go west before he got sick. He had a very clear picture of it. The valley, the farm, the particular quality of light he'd read about. He described it to the girls many times. Now he can't go, and we will." She said it without apology or performance, the simple accounting of a woman who had settled her grief into a decision. "I want you to know that my daughters are not a liability on this journey. They will do what they're told." "I don't doubt it." "The younger one, Corazon. She was frightened at first. She isn't anymore," Doss mentioned. She looked at him steadily. "Calhoun Doss is," she stopped. Started again. "There are men who are useful and men who are good. Sometimes these are not the same. He is both. Whatever August told you or didn't tell you, that's what I know about him. It seems to be the consensus. Consensus isn't usually wrong about a person. It's usually wrong about ideas." She moved toward the front of the wagon. "Good night, Mr. Sample." He took the lantern to Doss's wagon last. He'd left it last deliberately, and he thought Doss knew he'd left it last deliberately, because when Sample came around to the tailgate, Doss was there already, sitting on an upturned bucket with his elbows on his knees, waiting. "Pell tell you," Doss said. "Pell told me nothing. He said it wasn't his to tell." Doss looked at the ground between his boots. He had a way of organizing a long silence that Sample recognized, not stalling, not suffering through it, just taking the time that the thing required before it could be spoken correctly. "The man's name was Greer Abel," Doss said. "He was married to my sister Clara for 6 years. He lifted his eyes and focused them somewhere past Sample's shoulder at nothing, at the dark beyond the camp. "The first 3 years I didn't know. The last 3, I knew, and couldn't prove it in a way that would matter to anyone with authority over it. Where was your father? Dead. Before the war. It was just me and Clara. And the law. Doss looked at him now, directly. The sheriff in Millfield was Abel's brother-in-law. The judge who would have heard the case married Abel's cousin. If you're building a picture, that's the shape of it. And Abel. He came home drunk one night in February. Drunk or something else. I never had a clear answer on what he'd been into. He went for Clara, and I was there. Doss turned one of his hands over on his knee and looked at the palm, then set it back down. There was a fireplace poker involved. I didn't go there with it. It was just the first thing. Self-defense of a third party, Sample said. That is one way to describe it. What's another way? The way Millfield County described it was murder in the second degree. The warrant came from Judge Harlan Peck, who I mentioned, and was served by Sheriff Darby Peck, who is the judge's son. He paused. So. Sample turned the shape of it in his mind the way you turn a stone to find its weight. Not light, not impossible to carry, but with sharp edges that caught at things. A dead man who'd needed killing, a warrant issued by the dead man's family through the machinery of their official positions, and a paper that said murder when what it meant was, we are owed something, and we intend to collect it. How far behind are they? Sample said. Doss looked at him with a slight shift in his shoulders, a readjustment. He'd expected something else. You're not going to tell me you don't take men with warrants. I'm a bounty hunter, not a magistrate. I'm asking, how far behind? I don't know for certain. August has been watching our back trail. He thinks a week, maybe less. How many men? Abel Cord runs a recovery service out of Columbus. He's competent and he's not cheap, which means someone is paying real money for this. Doss reached into his breast pocket and removed a folded document and held it out. This is a copy of the warrant. August got it in Missouri through a lawyer he knew. Sample took it and held it to the lantern and read it. The charge was murder, second degree. The issuing authority was Judge Harlan M. Peck, Millfield County, Ohio. The surety bond was posted by a holding company called Abel Agricultural Partners, which was the kind of name that told you everything about who had money and how they'd gotten it, and who was paying Abel Cord's considerable fees. He folded it and handed it back. You should have told Pell to tell me this before I agreed, Sample said. I know it. Why didn't you? Doss was quiet for a moment. Because I needed you to agree. And I wasn't sure you would. He said it without apology, straight and level. I'm telling you now because you were going to find it out, and because I'd rather you hear it from me than feel like you were managed. Sample looked at him. Doss held the look with no performance in it. No calculation or appeal, just a man who had done a thing and stated it, and was waiting to see what came next. Sample had known men who killed without conscience, and men who killed with too much of it, and men who had passed through a killing and come out the other side, changed into something unrecognizable. Doss didn't fit any of those shapes. He sat on his bucket with his wide hands on his knees, and he looked like a man who'd made the only decision available to him, and was prepared to carry the weight of it for the rest of however long he had. Get some sleep, Sample said. We have a wheel to wait on, and I want to ride the first 10 miles of trail tomorrow and check conditions. Doss blinked once. That's it. Did you want more? I thought you might. He stopped. Looked at his hands again. No. All right. Sample turned to go. Sample. He stopped. I'm not going to run, Doss said. If Cord catches up. I'm not going to put these people in front of something that's mine to deal with. I heard you say it. I'll remember you said it. Sample took 2 steps and stopped again without turning. The fireplace poker. What about it? Where was your sister when it happened? A long pause. The night settled around the camp. The fire down to coals now, the stars doing their indifferent work overhead. She was on the floor, Doss said. I stepped over her to get to him. Sample walked back to his horse and untied it and led it to the picket line the group had set up along the creek. He worked in the dark, unhurrying, unbuckling and removing the saddle and hanging the bridle and rubbing the horse down with a cloth he kept in his saddlebag for this purpose. The horse turned its head and regarded him with the large, calm eye that horses turned on you when they were trying to decide if your mood was their problem. It isn't, Sample told it. He rolled his bedroll out under the Creedmoor wagon, which was the wagon he'd have chosen as most solidly packed and most likely to remain stationary through the night, and he lay on his back with his boots still on and his hat over his face and listened to the camp settle into its nighttime sounds, the horses at the picket, the creek, the distant call of something hunting in the dark grass. Abel Cord. A recovery service out of Columbus. 6 men, maybe more by now, on a back trail somewhere behind, working west at the same pace the wagons moved, which was slow enough that a determined rider on good horses could have closed the distance 3 times over already if they'd been pushing, which meant Cord was in no hurry or was gathering resources or was waiting for something. Waiting for what, Sample didn't know yet, and not knowing was a gap in his thinking that he'd need to fill before any of this resolved. The warrant was paper. Paper traveled through systems, judicial, political, financial, and those systems had pressure points the way a wagon had stress points, places where the load bore hardest and where a careful examination might reveal a crack. A warrant, issued by a judge who was the nephew of the dead man, was not necessarily a fraudulent warrant in law, but it was the kind of warrant that a federal magistrate might find interesting. Sample had 3 federal contacts, 2 of whom owed him something, and 1 of whom he owed something, and the geography of that debt structure was a card he hadn't played yet. He thought about what Doss had said. I'm not going to put these people in front of something that's mine. He thought about Clara Doss on the floor of a house in Ohio in February, and a man stepping over her. He thought about the Able Agricultural Partners, and their holding company name, and their warrant money, and the machinery of it all, how it moved, how it sustained itself, how you found the place where it was weakest. Abel Cord was not the problem. Abel Cord was the instrument. The problem was in Columbus, behind a desk, adding the cost of this enterprise to some ledger alongside the crops and the livestock and the other things the Abel family owned. The most satisfying dismantlement, in Sample's experience, was always the one you did at the foundation. He didn't have a plan yet. He had the shape of what a plan would need to address, which was a different thing, but the necessary first thing, and he set it aside and closed his eyes under his hat and let the sounds of the camp tell him what they had to tell him until sleep arrived and took the rest of it away. 3 days to the wheel. Then west. Somewhere behind them, Abel Cord was also sleeping under some sky in some camp, and in the morning he would do what men like Abel Cord always did in the morning. Calculate the distance to his quarry, check his equipment, consult his paper, and continue forward with the steady, merciless patience of a system that had never seriously imagined being stopped. Sample pulled his hat tighter over his face. He'd been the system once. He knew where it was thin. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. You ride like somebody's watching you, Corazon said. She was on the seat of her mother's wagon, 8 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and apparently none of her mother's interest in being indirect about things. She'd been studying Sample for the better part of an hour from that seat, the way children study things they've decided are worth the effort. And this was apparently her conclusion. Somebody usually is, Sample said. She considered this. Who? Different people, at different times. Are they watching now? Sample looked at the back trail, the long grass, the empty swell of the plain behind them, the sky sitting on the horizon with nothing between it and them for as far as the eye could negotiate. Not right now. Then why do you ride like it? He looked at her. She held it without blinking, which at 8 years old was either stubbornness or genuine curiosity. And in his experience, those two things were close enough in children that the distinction rarely mattered. Habit, he said. She appeared to accept this, and turned back to whatever she'd been doing before she started studying him, which involved a length of cord and a complicated series of knots that Pilar, beside her, was trying to replicate without success. Pilar was 10, and operated at a frequency of sustained patience that her younger sister did not share, which meant she'd been working at the same knot for 20 minutes and had not once expressed frustration about it, just untied it and started again, her fingers finding the cord without her eyes leaving the trail ahead. It was the second day out of Hayes City. The wheel held. The Belgians moved well in the morning cool, the mare setting a pace the gelding matched without negotiating, and the other teams had found their rhythm behind her by mid-morning of the first day. The trail here was well-traveled enough to be clear and poorly traveled enough to be honest. No ruts deep enough to trouble a loaded wagon. No washouts from the summer rains that had since dried into traps. Good country for moving through. The kind of country that made you understand why people crossed it, and then made you understand, 3 days later when the character of it changed, why they hadn't all made it. The grass was going. Not gone yet. Still running in long bronze waves under the September wind, but going. The color of something at the end of its season, past the lush and into the dry. Everything pointed now toward dormancy and the long wait. The light had the particular slant of early fall in open country, low and clarifying, cutting shadows long even at midday, making the world look like itself but more so. Harlan Creedmoor's wagon led, the Belgians out front, Harlan up on the seat with the reins held in the loose grip of a man who trusted his animals to do their job. He drove the way he did most things, without commentary, without adjustment, unless adjustment was required, conserving attention for the moments that needed it. Sample had watched him reset a loose wheel pin on the first afternoon without stopping the wagon, dropping off the seat to the running board, and back up in the time it took to cover 40 yards of trail. He'd done it as though it were unremarkable, and then it was. James rode alongside his father's wagon on a dun gelding that was not a good horse but was his horse, and he managed that distinction with the natural diplomacy of a boy who understood that loyalty and assessment were separate categories. He watched Sample when he thought Sample wasn't watching him, which Sample was, and what he did with the watching was not the hero worship of pure admiration but something more useful. He was studying technique. How Sample sat. How Sample read the terrain ahead. How Sample's hands moved or didn't move, depending on what was in front of them. The boy was taking notes in the way of someone who intended to use what he was writing down. On the second afternoon, Sample rode back along the column to where James was trailing and said, "Come up front." James came up without asking why. They rode in silence for a quarter mile, which was Sample's standard for assessing whether a young person could manage silence, and James managed it without filling it with talk, which was the answer to something Sample had been wondering about. "What do you see?" Sample said. James looked at the trail ahead, the grass, the sky. Ground softer on the left side of the trail. From the rain last week. "You've been keeping us right of center." What else? James looked longer. There's a creek maybe 2 miles ahead. The way the grass is, he searched for the word. Darker, Sample said. Darker. Yeah. Means water underneath. Creek crossings are where wagons break. When we get to it, I'll go through first, and we'll walk the teams across, not drive them. Your father knows this, but you should know it too. James nodded. He was quiet a moment. My father didn't cross before. He handles himself like he has. He figures things out. He watches how something works, and then he works it. James said it without pride, just as information, which was a kind of pride that didn't announce itself. My mother's the one who planned the whole trip. The route, the provisions, what to sell, and what to keep. My father's the one who made it possible to actually do it. That's a useful combination. She worries he doesn't get credit for it. He doesn't care about credit. James paused. She cares that he doesn't care. Sample looked at the trail. There was something in that. The whole compressed architecture of a long marriage visible in 3 sentences from a 16-year-old who had grown up inside it. He let it stand. They came to the creek at midday. Sample went through first at the shallowest point he could find, a gravel bar where the water ran knee-deep on his horse and the bottom was firm. He walked back through and brought each wagon across separately, Harlan first, then Pell, then Vasquez, then Doss. The Belgian mare went into the water with calm authority, and the gelding followed her as he followed her everywhere, and the wagon came across without drama. Pell's team needed more persuading, 2 of his horses planting themselves at the bank with the conviction of animals who had made a considered decision and intended to stand behind it until reconvinced, and Pell handling the reins with the frantic competence of a man who had read about this exact situation and was discovering that reading about a thing and doing a thing occupied different parts of a person. Let him take them, Sample said, meaning James, who was already off his horse. James went to the lead horse's head and spoke to it in a low, unremarkable voice and began to walk. And the horse considered the voice and the boy attached to it and took a step and then another and went into the water. Pell's face in the moments after held the particular expression of a man who has been rescued in a way that revealed his own inadequacy, and who is grateful and slightly diminished simultaneously. Thank you, Pell said to James. Yes, sir, James said, which was the correct answer. Doss crossed his own wagon without assistance, his team reading him through the reins the way trained animals read calm handlers. He came out on the far bank and climbed back to his seat and looked at no one, not from coldness, but from the self-containment of someone who had decided that drawing attention to competence was as much a waste as drawing attention to anything else. By the second evening, they had settled into the rhythms that groups find on a trail when the individuals in them have made their peace with proximity. Camp positions established not by negotiation, but by the logic of who needed what. The Creedmoor fire central and largest because Ruth cooked for Pell as well as her family, and Pell contributed provisions, and this arrangement satisfied everyone's practical requirements without anyone having to say so. Vasquez's fire slightly removed, not from exclusion, but from a different evening schedule. The girls to sleep earlier, the cooking done quicker, the night quieter. Doss's fire where it always was, set with the same low deliberateness, a fire that gave light and heat, and no more than that. Attended by a man who sat beside it each evening and did whatever small maintenance tasks had accumulated through the day, mending, sharpening, the patient upkeep of a man who kept his equipment as he kept himself. On the second evening, Corazon appeared at Doss's fire. She stood at the edge of it with the cord in her hands, and the complicated knot in some intermediate state, and looked at Doss until he looked up. My sister can't do this one, she said. Doss looked at the knot. He held out his hand, and she put the cord in it, and he examined the knot for a moment, and then began to work it, his wide fingers moving slowly enough that the process was visible, and Corazon watched with the focused attention of someone intending to learn rather than simply receive. "It's a bowline," Doss said. "You make the loop first, before anything else." "I made the loop." "You made a loop. A bowline loop has a specific, here." He handed it back, partially undone. "The cord goes through the loop, around behind, back through the loop. Rabbit out of the hole, around the tree, back in the hole." Corazon looked at the cord. Then at Doss. "That's a children's explanation." "It's the explanation that works," Doss said. She sat down at the fire uninvited and worked the knot. Doss watched without comment and went back to the leather strap he'd been mending. After a while, she had the knot. She held it up. He looked at it and nodded. "Show Pilar," he said. She left. Doss went back to the strap. Sample had been watching from the edge of the Creedmoor fire, and he looked away before Doss looked up and said nothing about it, and Ruth Creedmoor refilled his coffee cup without being asked, and said nothing about it either. The trail on the third day hardened as they moved west, the ground giving up the last of its moisture to the dry wind that came down off the mountain country, the grass shorter now and tougher, the kind that didn't wave but simply existed, low and stubborn, and designed for endurance rather than display. The sky had changed its character too, higher, bluer, thinner, the blue of altitude beginning to argue its way into the lower air. You could not see the mountains yet, but you were beginning to see their influence, the way a river changes before you see the flood. Sample ranged wide that day. He rode a half-mile off the trail to the north and then south, reading the ground, looking for the markers of the trail's state ahead, the way the draws ran, the grade of the land, where the next water would be, and whether it would be reliable. He crossed the track of shod horses 3 miles north of the trail, a day old at least, 4 or 5 animals moving west at a pace faster than a wagon, and he read this without stopping, riding through and past it, noting the direction and the depth and the spacing of the hoof prints, and filed away, held what they told him in the part of his thinking where things developed slowly into conclusions. He came back to the trail in the late afternoon. The wagons were making good time, Harlan's Belgians pulling the whole column forward with their steady authority. James was on his dun at the rear, watching the back trail, and he raised a hand to Sample as he rejoined the column, and Sample raised one back. And this exchange contained approximately everything that needed to be said about the back trail, which was nothing yet. That evening, after supper, after the fires had come down and Pell had retreated to his wagon with the combination of exhaustion and relief he displayed every night, as though each day's traveling had exceeded his expectations by surviving, Ruth Creedmoor appeared at Sample's shoulder. He was picketing his horse for the night. She stood with her hands at her sides, not the crossed arms stance of her working posture, something different, the posture of a woman who has decided to say a thing and is collecting herself for it. "I'll finish that," she said, meaning the picket. "Come sit." He sat on an overturned water bucket, near the low remains of the Creedmoor fire. She secured the horse with the same brisk capability she brought to everything, and then came and sat on the camp stool across from him and looked at the coals. "You need to know something about Calhoun Doss," she said. "All right." She looked at him. Whatever she'd expected, resistance, a question, something, his answer apparently wasn't it. "You're not going to tell me you already know. I want to hear what you know." She studied him for a moment with the eyes that were always doing 2 things at once, the surface conversation and the one underneath it. Then she turned back to the fire. "He killed a man in Ohio. A man named Abel. His sister's husband." "When did you learn this?" Indiana. Before we left, his sister came to me. Ruth was quiet for a moment, the coals breathing their low orange. Clara. She came to me because I'm a woman, and she needed to tell a woman. Another pause. She had a broken wrist that was healing badly, and bruising along her jaw that was 2 weeks old. And she told me what had happened for 6 years in that house, and what happened in February, and why her brother was gone and where he was going. Sample said nothing. She wanted someone with him who knew. In case. She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood what she meant. In case someone came for him, and the people around him needed to know whether to help or stand aside. What did you tell her? Ruth looked at the fire. I told her someone would know. The coals settled, a small collapse of heat, and the sound of the creek came back into the silence, and the horses moved on the picket, and somewhere out in the dark a nighthawk made its thin descending call and went quiet. The wrist, Sample said. Set wrong. She'll carry it crooked the rest of her life. Ruth's voice was level, reporting. The jaw was fading. There were older marks on her arms she didn't speak to. I didn't ask. Sample held his cup with both hands, though the coffee was gone. The sheriff in that county was family to the dead man, Ruth said. The judge, too. She knew what the verdict would be before it was given. Calhoun knew it, too. She told him to go, and he went. She turned from the fire and looked at Sample directly. He didn't want to leave her. She made him. The nighthawk called again, and this time something answered it from a different direction, and then both were silent. Thank you, Sample said. Ruth stood, picked up the camp stool, and walked back to the wagon. She didn't ask what he was going to do with what she'd told him, and he understood that she already knew he had a version of it, and that what she'd given him was not information, but Clara Doss's testimony, delivered through the one channel available to it, and that Ruth Creedmoor had been carrying it since Indiana, and had decided tonight was the night to put it down. He sat by the dead fire for a while. The camp was quiet around him, Pell's wagon dark, Doss's fire its usual low and careful light. The stars had taken full possession of the sky, the Milky Way running its cold river from one horizon to the other, indifferent and enormous and older than anything anyone had ever managed to do under it. He got on his horse and rode the back trail. Not far, 2 miles, 3, enough to put the camp behind him and let the dark and the open ground do whatever they were going to do to his thinking. The horse moved beneath him with the steady rhythm of an animal that didn't need to understand the purpose of a thing to do it well, and the grass went past on either side in the dark, and the trail unreeled behind them pale and empty. Clara Doss had a wrist set wrong that would run crooked the rest of her life. She'd sent her brother west with a wagon party, and stood in Indiana with that wrist and whatever else she was carrying. And the men with the warrant were the men who'd issued it. And the machinery behind it was the machinery of people who owned things and intended to keep owning them, and had built the local apparatus of law into an instrument of that intention. Sample had spent 14 years as part of an apparatus. He knew how apparatuses worked from the inside, where the authority was genuine and where it was borrowed, where the paper meant what it said, and where it was a tool for something else. He knew the difference between a warrant and justice the way a carpenter knew the difference between a blueprint and a house. What the Abel family had built in Hocking County was a blueprint. It had the shape of law and the feel of law, and it would kill Calhoun Doss as surely as law if it got its hands on him. His horse moved west under the stars. He thought about Clara Doss and her wrist. He thought about the crooked set of it, the bone that had gone its own way because no one had held it correctly when it needed holding. He thought about what that kind of damage required of the person carrying it. Not courage exactly, something more mundane than courage, the daily decision to pick things up anyway. He thought about what he was going to do when Abel Cord came. Because Cord was coming. The horse tracks he'd found 3 miles north were a day old and moving west, and they were not the tracks of men who were going home. He turned the horse and rode back toward the 4 fires, 3 dark and 1 low and careful, the lights of a small and temporary thing moving across an enormous and indifferent country, carrying what it carried, pointed where it was pointed, which was west and forward, and away from everything it had left behind. Away from everything that was following. Chapter 4. They came out of the tree line at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, 6 riders in a loose chevron, moving at the unhurried pace of men who had tracked something to ground, and saw no reason to run the last 100 yards. The wagons were an hour out of the previous night's camp, moving through open grassland where the trail ran straight and the sight lines were long in every direction, which was why Sample had pushed for the early start and why the open ground gave him no comfort now. He'd known since yesterday's back trail ride that someone was closing, seen the distant smear of dust the evening before, noted the way it held its position through the fading light rather than dispersing, the dust of animals being held to a pace rather than running free. He hadn't told the group. He'd done his thinking overnight, and now the thinking was done and the riders were here. He pulled his horse across to the left side of the column and stopped it broadside to the approaching men, which slowed the lead wagon, which was Pell, who saw the riders and went the color of old ash. "Keep moving," Sample said to him without looking at him. "Those are." "Keep moving." The wagons moved. Sample stayed. He watched the 6 riders come on, and built what he could of them at distance. The man in front sat his horse with the ease of someone who had spent years in the saddle and didn't think about it anymore, which meant either a cattleman's background or a lawman's, and the cut of his coat said neither. It was a city coat, good wool, Eastern-made, the kind of coat that said money was not the problem, and appearance was also not an afterthought. He had a rifle in a saddle scabbard and a sidearm on his hip, and his hands were on the reins and nowhere else, which was a statement of confidence rather than carelessness. The 5 behind him were working men. Sample read them in the aggregate, armed, capable, spread into a loose line without being told to, the instinctive positioning of men who had done this before. Not reckless. Not young. 2 of them had the particular forward set of former soldiers, the way the body remembered deployment even years after the fact. They stopped 20 yards out. The man in front said, "Eldridge Sample." Not a question. "That's right," Sample said. Abel Cord. He had a round, pleasant face that had learned to be pleasant the way some men's faces learn it, as a management tool rather than a disposition. His eyes were gray and steady, and evaluated Sample with the brisk thoroughness of a man reading a contract before signing. "I represent the interests of the Abel family of Hawking County, Ohio, acting under warrant issued by Judge Harlan Peck of Millfield." "I know who Judge Peck is." "Then this will go quickly." Cord reached inside his coat and produced a folded document and held it out at arm's length. "I have a warrant for the arrest and extradition of one Calhoun Doss, wanted in the murder of Greer Abel, February 14th of this year. I'm told he's traveling with your party." Sample didn't take the document. Cord kept it extended a moment longer, then drew it back and refolded it with the patient precision of a man accustomed to people who didn't cooperate immediately but did eventually. "I appreciate that this puts you in an awkward position. I've been in worse." "I'm sure you have. Your record as a marshal is, people speak well of it." He settled the document back inside his coat. "I'm not looking for difficulty. I want Doss, and I'll be on my way. The wagons had traveled perhaps 40 yards now, and had stopped because of course they had stopped. Sample had told Pell to keep moving, and Pell had moved until the situation made moving feel like abandonment, and at that point Pell's nerve had done what Pell's nerve generally did, which was reassess the instruction against the reality and find a compromise. Sample heard the creak of a brake being set. He didn't look back. "You've come a long way for one man," Sample said. "The Abel family takes its losses seriously. Greer Abel is the loss they're taking seriously." Something adjusted in Cord's pleasant face. Not offense exactly, more the slight recalibration of a man, noting that this conversation had a shape he hadn't entirely anticipated. He was a member of their family. He was the family's man, in a county where the family has interests. That's a different thing. Is it? Not a question either. Abel Agricultural Partners is what's paying your fee, Sample said. I looked at the warrant. The surety bond is right there on the face of it. Cord was quiet for a moment. Behind him, one of his men shifted in his saddle, Leather speaking briefly. The grass moved in a low wind coming off the mountains. You've had a look at a copy of the warrant. Doss carries a copy. He's a careful man. He is. He was careful enough to get 4 states ahead of us. Cord's tone didn't change. But we're here now. Sample looked past Cord at the 5 men behind him, reading them one more time. And what he read was this. They would do what Cord told them. They would do it without pleasure or reluctance. And they had done equivalent things many times before. They were not nervous. Nervous men were easier to manage because nervous men were always doing a second calculation about their own safety. These men had made their peace with the occupational risks and put them somewhere they didn't interfere with the work. That was the real problem with Abel Cord's operation. Not the guns. The calm. I want to talk to Doss, Sample said. I don't see why that. Because it's my party, and he's under my authority for the duration of this contract. And I'll talk to him before I make any decisions that affect him. You can wait here, or you can ride on, and we'll discuss what I heard you say with a federal magistrate. He let that sit a moment, let Cord feel the shape of it. Your call. Cord looked at him with the gray eyes and the pleasant, managed face, and Sample held it, giving him nothing, no hostility, no nerves, just the flat patience of a man who had sat at enough tables to know that the person who talked first generally lost. 5 minutes, Cord said. Sample turned his horse and rode back to the wagons. The group was arranged the way groups arrange themselves when they're frightened and pretending not to be. Everyone close together, everyone positioned so they could see the riders, nobody looking directly at the riders. Pell stood at the head of his wagon, with both hands on the seat rail. Ruth Creedmoor had come down from the Creedmoor wagon and stood in the grass with her arms crossed, watching the riders with the steady focus of a woman making a considered assessment rather than having a reaction. Harlan was up on the seat with the reins in his hands, which was the right place for him. James stood at the near lead horse's head, holding the bridle, calming the animal, doing something useful. Elena Vasquez had her daughters in the wagon behind the canvas. Sample could see the canvas move slightly, the older girl looking through the gap, and he caught the edge of Vasquez's hand closing the gap from inside, gently but completely. Doss was on his horse 10 yards out from the group, between the wagons and Cord's men, and he was watching Sample come back with the expression of a man who has already done the relevant arithmetic and arrived at a number he doesn't like. Sample rode up beside him and dropped his voice. They're not walking away without something. I know it. You said you wouldn't run. I meant it. Sample looked at him. Doss looked back with the dark eyes that had measured things since the first night at the fire, and there was no performance in his face now, no bravado, no fear badly concealed. A man who had fixed his position. "If I go with them," Doss said, "it goes to trial in Millfield County. Peck sentences me. I go to prison for 8 years minimum, more likely 12, in a facility where the Abel family has connections." He said it the way a man reads a survey map, not with emotion, with accuracy. "I want you to understand that I know what going with them means. I'm not operating under any confusion about it. You got a lawyer?" "My lawyer in Columbus told me the warrant was defensible if I could get it in front of a federal judge rather than a state court. The problem is getting it there from inside a Millfield County cell." "What's his name?" Doss looked at him. "Walter Gann. On Broad Street." A pause. "Why?" "Because I may need a name." Sample looked back at Cord, who was waiting with the stillness of a man who waited professionally. "Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell Cord that this warrant has a federal jurisdictional problem because you crossed state lines, which puts the extradition question in federal hands rather than Ohio's. I'm going to tell him I have contacts in the federal marshal's service who will find the circumstances of this warrant interesting. I'm going to tell him that pursuing this through proper federal channels will take 4 to 6 months, during which time you'll be in Oregon and entirely outside Ohio's practical reach. How much of that is true? The crossed state lines argument has some merit. I do have federal contacts. The rest of it is a hand I'm representing." Doss was quiet. He turned this over with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. "And if he calls the hand, then we'll find out what kind of morning this turns into. There are 6 of them." "There are," Sample said. "And there's you and me. And Harlan Creedmoor has a rifle under that wagon seat that I noted on the first inventory. And Ruth Creedmoor is standing in the grass right now, making a calculation I wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of." He looked at Doss steadily. "But I'd rather not find out. I'd rather Cord decides it's not worth it today. Because today, I can bluff him. Out here, in the open with witnesses, against a former federal marshal who knows Walter Gann's name. He let that land. In a canyon in Wyoming, it's different. You think he'll come back? He'll come back. But back is better than now." Doss looked at Cord's men for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands on his reins. Then he looked at Sample. "Do it," he said. Sample rode back. Cord had moved forward perhaps 5 yards while Sample was talking to Doss, which was a small statement about patience and its limits. His men had spread fractionally wider behind him. Sample noticed these adjustments and said nothing about them, which was its own statement. "Doss tells me this warrant came through Hocking County," Sample said. "It did. Doss crossed state lines in Indiana. By the time you're looking at him now, he's crossed 3 more." Sample kept his voice level, informational, the tone of a man explaining something that should already be understood. Extradition across multiple state lines on a felony warrant falls under federal statute, not state. Which means the issuing jurisdiction, Hocking County, does not have unilateral authority to execute this warrant in Kansas without federal endorsement. Cord looked at him. His pleasant face had gone neutral in the way it went when he was working. Not cold, but emptied of the social performance. Just the gray eyes and the intelligence behind them. "That's an interesting argument. It's a settled argument. I spent 14 years as a federal marshal. I know how jurisdiction works. Most bounty hunters aren't federal marshals. I'm not a bounty hunter right now. I'm the contracted guide and protector of this party. That gives me standing over who approaches this group and under what legal authority. Sample let a beat pass. You want to test that in front of a federal magistrate? I'll give you the name of two of them who owe me a conversation. You can ride to the nearest telegraph office and wire them right now. I'll wait. Cord was quiet. Somewhere behind Sample, a horse stamped, and Pell made a small, involuntary sound that carried farther than Pell intended it to. Sample did not react to it. You're protecting a wanted man, Cord said. I'm protecting a man with a contested warrant issued by a judge who is materially related to the deceased. Harlan Peck is Greer Abel's nephew through the Abel family's second son. He watched Cord's face. You know this. You took the job anyway, which tells me what the Abel family is paying, and it tells me they want Doss badly enough to spend real money. Which makes me wonder what they're afraid he knows, given that they could just as easily have let a dead man stay dead. Something happened in Cord's face then. Not much. A compression at the corners of his eyes, the slight tightening of a man who has heard a sentence he didn't expect, and is deciding how to process it. It was there, and then it was gone, and the pleasant management was back, but Sample had seen it. He filed it away. No, he held it. Let it sit in the back of his thinking, where it could develop. Doss killed a man, Cord said. Doss killed a man who was beating his sister. In the sister's house. With whatever came to hand. Sample looked at him steadily. You know this too. You read the same case file I'm reading from the warrant. The responding officer's notes are right there in the discovery materials. I assume you have a copy of those, a man as thorough as you. Cord said nothing. They note that the deceased's wife was found on the floor with contusions consistent with assault prior to the incident. That's their language. Prior to the incident. Sample paused. So. Cord looked at him for a long time. The morning had gone fully bright now. The sun off the grass, giving everything a flat, hard illumination that left nowhere to stand that wasn't visible. The Creedmoor lead horses shifted against their traces. Somewhere, a meadowlark made its argument to no one in particular, and fell silent. I want Doss, Cord said. He said it quietly, without heat, which made it more significant than if he'd said it loudly. I understand that. The Abel family wants Doss. I understand that too. What they want, and what the law provides them are two questions, and right now those two questions are having a disagreement that a federal court will need to resolve. Sample picked up his reins. You know where to file. When that federal endorsement comes through, you come find us, and we'll have a different conversation. Until then, this party is moving west and Doss is part of it. Cord looked past him at the wagons, at Doss on his horse, at the open grassland stretching west toward where the mountains eventually would be. He was doing the arithmetic, and Sample let him do it, because the arithmetic was the point. 6 men against a former marshal on open ground, in daylight, with 6 civilian witnesses, none of whom looked like they'd done him the favor of forgetting the morning. The federal argument might hold in court, or it might not, but it would hold long enough to cost the Abel family money and time and the attention of people they might prefer not to attract. And Abel Cord was a professional, and professionals understood cost. The gray eyes moved back to Sample. This isn't finished, Cord said. I didn't think it was. Cord held the look for 3 seconds. Sample counted, and then he turned his horse with a single touch of his knee, and the 5 men behind him shifted and turned, and the chevron reformed and moved back toward the tree line at the same unhurried pace it had come from. Sample watched them go. He watched until they reached the trees and passed into them, and the tree line gave nothing back. He watched for another 30 seconds after that, reading the stillness the way you read it after thunder, waiting to hear whether it was moving away or gathering. He turned his horse. The group had come forward while his back was turned. Pell down from his wagon, Doss still on his horse, James Creedmoor on foot leading the Belgian mare, Ruth standing in the same place she'd been standing the whole time, which was the furthest forward of anyone, 20 yards out from the lead wagon, still with her arms crossed, still watching the tree line over Sample's shoulder with an expression that said she was prepared to keep watching it for as long as it required. Pell said, "Did it?" "Get back on your wagon," Sample said. "But we're moving. Now, we've lost 20 minutes. He rode past Pell to the head of the column. "I want distance between us and that tree line before noon. James, get those horses moving." James went to the lead pair. The Belgian mare tossed her head once, and then stepped into her traces, and the wagon rolled. Doss came alongside Sample as the column formed up. He didn't say anything for 100 yards. Then, the part about what they're afraid he knows. "What about it?" "That wasn't in the bluff." "No," Sample said. "It wasn't." Doss looked at him. Sample watched the trail ahead, the grass bending in the same low wind, the mountains invisible still but present, the way debt is present before the bill arrives. "What do you think they're afraid of?" Doss said. "I don't know yet. But Cord knew what I meant when I said it, and a man who knows what you mean when you say something is a man who's been thinking about it already." Sample kept his eyes on the trail. What was Greer able, besides Clara's husband? Doss was quiet for a long moment, the horses working beneath them, the wagons rolling, the grass going past on either side in its long, indifferent waves. "He managed land," Doss said slowly. "For the family. Acquisitions. There were properties, I never had the details." What does that mean?" "It means I'm thinking," Sample said. "Keep moving." The column rolled west. Sample rode at its head with the trail running out ahead of him, and Abel Cord's men in the trees behind him, and a dead man's land business somewhere in the back of his thinking, turning slowly, acquiring weight. Cord had blinked. But Sample had seen what happened in Cord's face when the question was asked, and what he'd seen was not the reaction of a hired man who'd been told only what he needed to know. It was the reaction of a man who knew more than the warrant said, and had for one unguarded moment shown it. Whatever Greer Abel had been managing, it was worth more to the Abel family than the cost of Abel Cord. Sample filed nothing. He held everything. The grass ran on ahead of them like a river. Behind the tree line, 6 men had stopped and were waiting for something. He could feel it. Chapter 5. Nobody spoke for the first 2 hours. Not from any agreement about it. Nobody convened and decided on silence. It simply descended the way silence descends after a loud thing, filling the space the loud thing had occupied, and the group let it. The wagons rolled. The Belgians pulled. The grass went past. The tree line where Cord's men had gone fell back and shrank and eventually became a dark seam along the horizon, and then the horizon swallowed it, and there was nothing behind them but open country and the trail, and the long shadowless light of a morning that had no interest in what had just happened in it. Pell drove his wagon with both hands on the reins, though his horses needed no instruction, needing to hold something. His back was to Sample, and Sample could read the set of it, the slight forward hunch, the shoulders not quite level, the posture of a man who had been frightened and was reconstructing his dignity one vertebra at a time. Harlan drove with his usual stillness. If the encounter had registered on him, beyond the practical, he gave it no surface. He'd watched the whole thing from the wagon seat with the reins loose in his hands, and when Cord's men turned and rode back into the trees, Harlan had clicked to his horses, and the column had started moving, and that was his entire editorial on the subject. James had dropped back to the rear of the column after it started rolling. He was back there now, 100 yards behind Doss's wagon, watching the back trail in the same steady way he'd developed over the past 3 days. And Sample thought about the boy watching, and what he was learning from it, and whether that was a thing to be concerned about or a thing to be glad of, and arrived at the same place he usually arrived with James Creedmoor, which was that the boy was going to be all right, regardless of what Sample thought about it. Doss rode beside his wagon, rather than driving it. He tied his team loosely to the rear of Vasquez's wagon, and rode his horse alongside at the column's pace, and he looked at the country they were moving through with the eyes of a man doing the work of being in the present moment, because the alternative was a place he couldn't afford to go. Sample had seen this in men after close things. The discipline of the present tense. It was Corazon who broke the silence. She appeared at the front of her mother's wagon, pulling the canvas aside, and looked at the country ahead with the frank assessment of someone who had been inside long enough. "Are they gone?" she said. "Yes," Sample said. "Are they coming back?" Pilar's hand appeared at the canvas edge and closed over her sister's shoulder, a gentle backward pressure that Corazon ignored. "Not today," Sample said. Corazon considered this answer, running it against whatever internal standard she applied to adult responses. "That's not the same as no." "No," Sample said. "It isn't." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then Pilar's hand became more specific about its intention, and Corazon let the canvas close. Sample heard them settle back inside, Pilar's voice low and continuous, doing the older sister's work of interpretation and reassurance, translating the world for someone who received it too directly. Vasquez appeared at the front of her wagon a minute later, taking Corazon's vacated position on the seat. And she looked at Sample, and he looked at her, and she turned her eyes to the trail ahead. That was the whole exchange. It covered what it covered. Around mid-morning, the country began to change. Subtle first, the grass shortening, the soil under it going lighter, the draws between the low swells running dry where 3 days ago they'd held water. The sky sharpened itself on the altitude, and the blue of it deepened the way it deepened as you moved west, and the air thinned and the light had less to push through. To the northwest, at the absolute limit of what the eye could resolve, something white sat on the sky that was not cloud. Ruth Creedmoor came forward on foot. She'd been walking beside her wagon for the past hour. She did this most mornings, she said. It kept her from calcifying, which Sample had taken as a comment about the wagon seat, and later thought might have been about more than that. She came up alongside his horse, and walked with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at the horizon. "Is that snow?" she said. "The first of it. Up high." "How far?" 3 weeks. Maybe less before we need to be through the low passes. She walked with this for 100 yards. Her boots were good boots, already trail-marked, and she walked in them with the long stride of a woman who had decided that distance was a thing to be covered rather than suffered. What he said, Cord. That it wasn't finished. No. He meant it. He's not a man who says things he doesn't mean. It's part of what makes him difficult. Sample watched the country ahead. He'll get federal endorsement on the warrant. Or he'll try. Walter Gann in Columbus may have something to say about that, but it takes time either way. How much time? Enough to get where we're going, and have Doss in a territory where Ohio's reach is philosophical rather than practical. He looked down at her. That's the plan as it stands. Ruth nodded once, the nod of a woman receiving a briefing rather than a reassurance. And if the endorsement comes faster than the plan allows, then we deal with it on better ground than open Kansas. She absorbed this. You're not going to tell me there's nothing to worry about. I wasn't going to, no. Good. She turned and walked back along the column toward her wagon. Sample watched her go and thought about Clara Doss in Indiana with her wrist and her brother pointed west, handing her testimony to a woman she'd just met because there was no other mechanism for it. No court that would hear it, no official body that would record it and act on it and put its weight on the other side of the scale. Just Ruth Creedmoor walking the trail with her hands clasped behind her back, carrying it. He rode forward. Around noon, they stopped to rest and water the teams at a creek that Sample had been aiming for since morning. Shallow and reliable, the kind of crossing that required no strategy, just patience. While the horses drank, Pell appeared at Sample's stirrup with a tin cup of coffee, already poured, held up without comment, and Sample took it. And that was the closest Pell came to saying what he wanted to say, which was something about that morning, something that wanted to be gratitude but was too complicated for the word. "You eat," Sample said. "Not yet." "Eat something." Pell retreated to his wagon and came back with bread and dried meat, and sat on a rock at the water's edge, and ate with the methodical attention of a man making himself do a necessary thing. He'd recovered his color since the morning. The hands were still, the hat on his head rather than in his hands. Sample watched the horses drink and thought about nothing particular, which was a different quality of nothing than the nothing in the Meridian Saloon. Not empty, but open, the way country opens when you're moving through it rather than waiting in it. Doss came to water his horses and stayed at the creek after they'd drunk, standing with his hands in his back pockets, looking downstream. Sample brought his horse down and let it drink again and stood beside Doss. "The part about what they're afraid of," Doss said. It was the second time he'd said it. The first had been on the trail right after Cord left, and Sample had said he didn't know yet, and the conversation had ended there. Something about the second time, said Doss, had been working it since. "Greer managed acquisitions," Sample said. "Land. For the family." "Yes." "Any sense of the scale of it?" Doss looked downstream, water running over the rocks in its small, continuous argument. He was gone 2-3 weeks at a time. Clara said he came back from those trips different, not drunk, something else. Wound up and pleased with himself. Like a man who'd gotten away with something. He paused. She said the good moods were almost worse. At least when he was in a dark mood, she knew the shape of what was coming. Sample thought about Cord's face, that quarter second of recognition when Sample had asked what the Abel family was afraid Doss knew. Cord had suppressed it fast, but it had been there. The look of a man who has been handed a piece of information he wasn't expecting, and doesn't want to show that he was carrying the same piece already. He may have known more than he realized, Sample said, about what Greer was acquiring and how. Doss turned and looked at him. "How do you mean?" "A man who manages acquisitions for a family that has the local judiciary in its pocket isn't acquiring things through entirely clean channels. And a man like that, living the way Greer lived, probably talked when he was in his good moods." Sample looked at the water. "Things come out, even when people don't mean them to." Doss was quiet for a moment. Clara never said anything about. She may not have known she heard it. Sample picked up his reins. Or she may have set it aside because she had other things to manage. He let that sit. Doss looked at the water for a long time. Then he looked at his hands, the wide, careful hands, and turned them over once and put them back in his pockets. "If there's something that would change the case. I don't know what there is. I know there might be something, and I know where to start looking for it." Sample looked at him. "Walter Gann. You said his name to Cord." "I did. Deliberately." Doss worked through what that meant. You wanted Cord to know that Gan was in this. I wanted the Abel family to know, and Cord was the fastest way to deliver the message. A lawyer in Columbus, who's been working the jurisdictional angle on this warrant, is a man who might also be interested in what Greer Abel was doing on his acquisition trips. Sample kept his voice level, informational. The Abel family has been thinking about this warrant as a tool to silence Doss. I want them to start thinking about it as a liability. Doss looked at him with something that took a moment to identify because he didn't wear it the way most men did. It was not gratitude. It was the look of a man recalibrating the size of a problem he'd been certain he understood. He'd been carrying this as a thing that would either catch him or not catch him, a simple binary. And Sample had just introduced a third possibility that had not been in his original calculations. You said the bluff was a hand you were representing, Doss said. The jurisdictional argument is a hand. What I just described is a different hand. Sample looked at the trail ahead, the country opening west. Some pots you win on the show. Some you win before you get there. Doss said nothing for a moment. Then, I need to write to Clara. Next town with a post office. There'll be one in 2 days. Sample put his foot in the stirrup. Don't tell her details. Tell her to talk to Gan. He rode back to the head of the column. The afternoon was cool and clear, and the country moved through its changes the way it did this time of year in this part of the world. Not dramatically, not with the sudden confrontations of mountain terrain, but with the steady accumulation of a landscape becoming something other than what it was when you entered it. The grass was shorter, the draws deeper. The sky had stepped back to a height that made you feel the smallness of 4 wagons on a trail, not unpleasantly, but honestly. James came up from the rear in the middle of the afternoon, pulling alongside Sample. Nothing on the back trail, James said. Since when? 2 hours. The dust they raised when they left settled before we stopped for water. Nothing since. Good. James held his position beside Sample rather than dropping back, which meant he had something else. Sample gave him space for it. That man Cord, James said. He had paper. He had paper. And you told him the paper didn't mean what he said it meant. I told him the paper had a problem. Which it does. James looked at the trail ahead, working through the next question. But if the paper was, if the law behind it was legitimate. The law behind it was a judge who was the dead man's nephew handing a warrant to a sheriff who was the dead man's cousin's son. James was quiet for a moment. That's not legitimate. No. But it looks like it is. It's built to look like it is. That's the work. Sample watched the country. Men who run things don't usually come for you themselves. They build a structure that comes for you instead. It wears the law's coat, and it walks in the law's shoes, and when it arrives at your door, it has paper with official seals on it. He paused. The seal is real. The judge who signed it is real. The office exists. It's just been pointed at something that serves the man who runs things, rather than the thing it was built to serve. James rode with this for a while, the dun beneath him working steadily, the afternoon light cutting long and amber across the grass. How do you fight something like that? He said. Carefully, Sample said. And from the right direction. James nodded slowly. Not the nod of understanding, but the nod of a 16-year-old shelving a thing to be opened later when he had more tools for it. It was the right response. Sample thought about what the boy would do with it in 5 years, in 10, when he had the tools and the occasion, and found himself standing in front of something that wore the law's coat, and was pointed at someone who didn't deserve it. He thought he'd know what to do. They camped that night on a flat piece of ground above a dry creek bed where the cottonwoods grew in their ghost-pale rows, bare-limbed now, the leaves down, the white bark catching the last of the light and holding it after the sun was gone. Fires went up, horses were picketed. The Creedmoor fire drew its usual assembly. Corazon showed Pilar the bowline knot in the firelight, slowly, the rabbit, and the tree and the hole, and Pilar got it on the third attempt and held it up, and Corazon said something in Spanish that made her mother exhale through her nose in a way that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. Doss sat at his own fire and wrote a letter. He wrote slowly, the way a man writes when the words need to carry more than words can carry, and he is trying anyway, bending over the paper with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything. And when he finished, he folded it and put it in his breast pocket against his chest, where it would stay until the next town and the post office there, and then it would travel east against the direction of everything else in this story, back toward Indiana, back toward a woman with a wrist set wrong, who had sent her brother into the country and was waiting to hear that the country had received him. Sample sat apart from the fires that night. He'd eaten and done his rounds, horses, wagons, back trail, sky, and now he sat on a rise above the camp with his back to a cottonwood and his knees up and looked west. The bluff had worked. Today. Cord had done the arithmetic and found it unfavorable and turned around, and that was a real thing that had happened and had bought real time, and Sample was not going to diminish it by pretending it was less than it was. But he knew what Cord's retreat was and was not, and what it was not was an ending, and the old marshal in him, the part that had spent 14 years thinking in the structures of law and its instruments, that part was doing its own accounting. He'd lied. Not to a corrupt man, not to a man with dirty paper. Cord himself was not corrupt. He was contracted and the paper was ugly, but it was real paper from a real court. Sample had looked a recovery agent with legitimate standing in the eye and told him a jurisdictional argument would hold, and it might hold and it might not, and he'd represented it as settled when it wasn't. He turned it over, left it settled where it sat. The distinction between what justice was and what happened in its name had never been a clean one in his experience, and this was not the moment it was going to become clean. Clara Doss's wrist was crooked. Greer Abel was in the ground, and the men who'd used him were spending money to prosecute the man who'd put him there. Somewhere in the acquisition records of the Abel family's holdings, there was likely something that Walter Gann could use, if Gann was the man Doss believed him to be, if the Abel family had the vulnerabilities Sample suspected they had. And they did, because men who built that kind of county-level machinery always had something underneath it they needed the machinery to protect. He'd find out what it was. Not tonight. Tonight the wagons were intact, and the group was whole, and Cord's men were a day's ride east, and the snow on the mountains was 3 weeks away, and the passes were still open. He heard Pell before he saw him, the particular footfall of a man who was trying to be quiet about an approach and was not built for quiet. Pell appeared at the edge of the rise and stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, looking west in the same direction Sample was looking. "Mind?" Pell said. Sample moved over slightly on the flat ground, which was the answer. Pell sat. He had his coat buttoned to the throat, and his hat squared on his head, and he sat the way men sit when they're preparing to say something they've been rehearsing. Sample waited. They sat in silence for a while. The fires below had come down, the camp settling toward sleep, and the dark pressed in from all directions with the soft, complete pressure of open country at night. No town within 30 miles, no light on any horizon but the stars. "This morning," Pell said and stopped. "Yes." I froze. "You stopped the wagon." "I told them to keep moving." "I meant to." He looked at the dark, to the west. When those riders came out of the trees, everything I'd told myself about what I would do if this happened went somewhere I couldn't find it. That happens to most people. I'm supposed to be responsible for these families. I recruited them. I put this party together. His hands came out of his pockets and went flat on his knees, which was where they went now rather than the table, the same gesture relocated. Mrs. Vasquez has 2 daughters. The Creedmores have a boy. I am responsible. You got Gon's copy of the warrant, Sample said. In Missouri. You tracked me down in Hays City before Cord could close the distance. You left Indiana in the first place when it would have been easier to stay. Sample looked at the darkness ahead of them. There are different ways to be responsible for people. Freezing for 30 seconds when 6 armed men come out of the trees is not the one that matters. Pell was quiet. Then, slowly, the tension in his shoulders released, not all of it, but the part that had been held since morning. The night moved around them. An owl somewhere in the cottonwoods made its soft, repetitive inquiry into the dark. The horses shifted on the picket. You think they'll come back? Pell said. Yeah. Pell waited. The wait became a long silence, and Sample didn't fill it, and Pell seemed to understand finally that Sample had said the thing he had to say about it, which was the thing that was true, which was the only answer worth giving to a man who had asked a real question. Pell stood, brushing the dry grass from his coat. He looked west for a moment, at the dark where the mountains were that they couldn't see, and then he went back down toward the camp. Sample stayed. He thought about Cord somewhere east, already calculating the federal angle, already composing the telegram to Columbus, already reporting back to the Abel family that the recovery had been delayed by a former marshal with jurisdictional objections and federal connections. He thought about what the Abel family would do with that report. Whether they'd instruct Cord to proceed carefully and legally and slowly, or whether the jurisdictional complication would make them nervous enough to try something faster and less documented. He thought about what a man afraid of his own records did when someone started asking about them. He thought about Greer Abel on his acquisition trips, coming home wound up and pleased with himself, and Clara setting a plate in front of him and watching his face and knowing the good mood was its own kind of dangerous. The mountains were out there in the dark, carrying their first snow, waiting. He stood, and his right knee said something brief and factual about the cold and the damp ground, and he went back down to the camp. He checked the picket line. Checked the back trail one more time, the empty dark of it, nothing moving. Walked the perimeter of the wagons in the order he always walked it, Creedmoor, Pell, Vasquez, Doss, and at Doss's wagon he stopped. Doss was awake. He was lying in his bedroll with his arms behind his head, looking up at the canvas, the way a man lies when sleep hasn't arrived and he's stopped fighting it. The letter's written, Doss said without turning. Good. Tell me what you need me to do when Cord comes back. Follow my lead. Don't offer yourself. Doss looked at the canvas. You told me not to offer myself this morning, too. You did what I asked. I did. He was quiet a moment. It went against something. I know it. I'm not afraid of what happens to me if he takes me. I mean, I am, but that's not the part that, he stopped. Found the right direction into it. I don't want these people in front of my problem. I know that too. Sample looked at the dark beyond the wagon. What I told you this afternoon. About the records. About Gan. Yes. If that comes to anything, if there's something there, your problem stops being just yours. It becomes the Abel family's problem. And a family that's defending its own exposure doesn't have the same appetite for a murder warrant that it had when the warrant was cheap. He let that develop. That's not guaranteed. It's a direction. Doss looked at the canvas for a long time. Clara sent me away, he said. She put my hand down when I tried to stay. She said, go west, Cal. There's nothing here that's going to get better by you staying in it. He took a slow breath. She was right. She usually is. Sample said nothing. I'd like her to be able to come west too, Doss said. When this is settled. If it settles. Write that in the next letter. Doss turned his head and looked at him. And whatever was in his face at that moment was not something that needed a name or a description. Sample held it a second, and then walked on. He rolled his bedroll out under the Creedmoor wagon. Same position as every night. The packed earth familiar now, the particular smell of this camp, dry grass and wood smoke, and the faint animal warmth of the horses, arranged into something that had begun to feel not like home, but like the thing that preceded it. He lay on his back. Above him, the wagon's undercarriage was a dark geometry. The axles and the boards, and beyond it the open sky, stars more numerous than the eye could process, the same sky that sat over Indiana and Ohio and Columbus, where Walter Gann had an office on Broad Street, the same sky that Cord and his men were sleeping under somewhere to the east. Tomorrow, they'd make 20 miles if the ground held. The day after, a town with a post office. After that, the land would begin its long rise toward the mountains, and the trail would narrow, and the decisions that distance had been absorbing would become decisions that they'd have to make themselves on the ground in real time. Cord would get his federal endorsement, or he wouldn't. The Abel family would show their hand, or they wouldn't. Gann would find something in the records, or he wouldn't. And in the meantime, 4 wagons moved west through country that didn't care about any of it, through the long bronze grass and the hardening ground, and the cold coming down from the mountains like a slow decision. And the people in those wagons slept or didn't sleep, and dreamed or didn't dream, and carried what they were carrying, which was everything they'd brought from the east and everything they'd acquired since, the weight of it distributed across 4 wagon beds and 12 horses, and 7 people, and 1 man who rode at the head of the column watching the horizon with the attention of someone who expected it to change. It would change. Morning would come with whatever it brought, and the trail would continue, and the mountains would get closer, and behind them the unfinished thing would continue its approach at the pace of a professional who was not in a hurry because he did not believe in losing, only in delay. Sample pulled his hat over his face. The wagons would roll west. They always did, until they didn't. The end.